Hello, and welcome to our D2 student panel. I'm Noelle Hale, the program director of the Napa Valley Wine Academy's WSET diploma program. And today I'm joined by three students who recently passed their D2 exams. We're going to hear about their experiences and what advice they would give other students about to start the wine business unit of the WSET diploma. First, I'd like to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. So, Micheline, I see you are in the top right. So I'd love to hear a little bit about you.
Hi, my name is Micheline Lopez Estrada, and I live in Maryland. My professional background is in IT. I'm a computer engineer with also some business background. I'm currently retired for a couple of years as I'm dedicating to travel around the world as part of my kind of 3 or 4 years of traveling. I do not have any wine business experience, so I have never worked in the industry. I do have invested in a restaurant, part of an investor in a restaurant in the area where I live. So that's as close as I get to the business industry.
Cool, thank you. And then I'm going to keep going around what I see for the circle here. So, Sylvie, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, well, I'm Sylvie Tannhauser. I live in Napa. I've been in the wine industry close to 2 decades, and actually, I am a hospitality manager at the winery in Napa. So at this time, I have background in wine, basically all my life. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
Nice.
And then, last but certainly not least, Randy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello there. I'm Randy Chilcote. I'm actually from Michigan, and I'm an emergency medicine physician, and I don't have any experience in the wine industry, so possibly a second career.
All right, just a glutton for punishment. Oh my goodness. So,
True.
all right.
So true.
Well, thank you guys. And so, to recap for any viewers who might not know, D2 is the second unit in the WSET level 4 diploma. So, it covers wine business, everything from the different types of producers in the wine industry to the different forms of retail and market structures to SWOT analyses. And so um, some people come in feeling a little nervous about it. And so whether that's because, you have wine industry experience, but maybe not business experience, or I hear from students who, maybe have an advanced degree or plenty of business experience, but don't work in the wine industry. And so they get very nervous about how, that will translate over. And so, um, yeah, if you felt a little nervous heading into, you're certainly not alone. And so that's actually one thing I wanted to ask all of you guys is, did anybody feel nervous heading into D2?
I I
Well,
can
I can
I
go
can
next.
answer. Go ahead.
Micheline, you go first.
Yeah,
Okay,
Michigan goes.
I can answer. I was going very nervous into D2 because I was just coming out of failing D1. So I was trying to apply what I did not do in D1 into D2 in order to be able to not run out of time. So, from my perspective, I was coming in with a strategy of time management because that was what I failed to do in D1. Um, that on top of that, English is my second language, so it take a little bit longer for me to decipher what the question is asking and then to put together a cohesive answer on a short amount of time. So I really practice time management for D2 in order to be able to kind of answer um, the questions within the allotted 60-minute time.
Yeah. Okay, and we're going to come back to that as well, definitely. Both timing and how do you dealing with an exam failure, right? Because that's no fun. So we will come back to that because you all, and I know I said this at but you will have managed to pass D2. So yeah. Anyway, but Randy, what were you nervous about?
Well, I think you already kind of spoke about it a little bit, but yeah, I have no wine business experience, so you just kind of feel like you're starting off a little bit behind the eight ball. You sit in the classes and you hear people that have been in the industry that are doing the WSET. Your perception is everybody but you is doing in the wine industry, but that's not true. You learn later. But so yeah, you just feel like you're a little bit behind from the start because you don't understand how the business model works, and you don't really know or understand the language as much, And I got to laugh because I actually feel like in medicine, it's kind of like in medicine. So when you do medical school and you go through like cardiology and internal medicine and pediatrics, and you're kind of moving along those stages. Everything's kind of the same, but a little bit different. Then you hit OB, and OB is like a whole different language. And that's kind of what happens to me in the diploma degree. You're kind of moving through your sparkling wine, and then you move over to fortified wines, and that's a little bit of the same but different. And then you go to Wines of the World, it's a little bit the same but different. Then all of a sudden you have this business, and you're like, what? And I have to pass a business test? Are you kidding me? And that's my intimidation.
Fair enough. All right. Sylvie, did you have anything you wanted to add? I mean, you're kind of the opposite of these two.
Yeah, so I wasn't that nervous. I was just, I just went for it because I already know some of the foundation of D2. So it was just learning extra things. But I wasn't that nervous because it's quite a small chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. Did anybody feel differently about D2 than they did about D1? Whether that was more or less worried?
Yeah, D2 for me, from a material perspective, was a less worry because I have a business background. So the concept of SWOT, the 5 Ps, all that I have used in my business in computer engineering, doing projects. So I was familiar with those concepts with supply and demand and currency fluctuation. All of that was natural for me. But I had to learn, like Randy was saying, the wine language, which is different from my IT language that I've done 30 years on it. So I felt the material was less intimidating than D1. I think D1 has such a monumental amount of information for those that are not in the business that that is quite of intimidating versus D2.
Yeah. Yeah. Randy, what about you coming from outside the
Yeah,
wine?
I thought actually for me, and I think everybody's different, it kind of depends where you come from. So I come from a huge science background. I've had like 30 plus, classes in science. So, when I was studying D1, it's kind of in your wheelhouse, and you're talking about, photosynthesis, and you're talking about acid, and you're talking about, there's whatever, the anatomy of a grape and all that's just it felt like it was more, uh, more my language. And then when I got to business, and especially when you hit about chapter 8, and that's pretty sad, isn't it, that I know exactly where it starts, but you get into the marketing model, when you start into your SWOTs and your 5 Ps and all that. I felt like that was a lot more what WSET is trying to do, where they try to make you understand more than just, state definitions and facts. You had to kind of understand a little bit more of how the marketing model worked. And so I thought that took a little extra work in those areas.
Yeah, fair enough. And when I was doing my diploma, it was a few years ago, and they've made some big changes since then. But yeah, I will admit I did not understand what a SWOT analysis really was. So anyway, it took me a little bit to wrap my head around. So I mean, kind of on that note, did anybody have any topics that you thought were particularly challenging? Sylvie, maybe?
I think it's more the finance, when they were asking about the finance, the primeur and all that. Oh my God. That was a little bit more difficult. But what I learned is that you need to understand the concept. You need to understand where they're going with it and why that's important. And that made it easier for me.
I like that. Fair enough. And then Randy, were you going to say something?
Just yeah, kind of what I stated. I think for sure the around that the whole marketing chapters where it's like chapter 8 on where you start into the 5 Ps and the SWOT. I mean, that was all difficult stuff, and you had to spend some time doing it. You can't just memorize facts, and I'll probably go into it a little bit later, but you need to understand how all that stuff works. And quite frankly, the best way to do that is to do the old test questions and do the test questions with the rubrics, because you may already know this, but the European grading system is a little bit different, and I can't really put my finger on it and tell you exactly what it is, but it's one of those things that when you do the old questions, especially when you're doing like SWOT and you're doing the 5 Ps, when you do that, you start to kind of understand what they're looking for. You see that in the rubric. You're like, your brain just kind of starts to understand. You're like, okay, I'm starting to see what they're really looking for here. So I found that to be extremely important to do that. And I also felt like if you get a SWOT question, there's a lot of different ways they can kind of ask that question. It's not just always straightforward. Of course, they're never going to say define what a SWOT is, because that's too easy. It's always, plugging something into the SWOT. And the more of those questions that you practice on, the more different angles you kind of see that they can ask that question. And it's the same with the 5 Ps. I can't say enough, and I'll probably talk to you about this for the whole hour, that by far and away, my biggest pearl is to do the questions for many reasons, but we can stop right there. But that really helped me.
Okay, yeah, well, we'll come back to that definitely. So, well, that actually brings up a kind of a question, another question I wanted to ask, which was, by the time students start D2, everybody has been through the D1 course. Most students will have taken the D1 exam by then as well. And one of the big things that we work, to really make students aware of and give people an opportunity to practice in D1 is, understanding how the WSET asks its questions, right? Because they have this idea of the command verbs, right? And so when they ask you to describe something versus them asking you to explain or evaluate something, those words are clues to tell you how they want you to answer, and to some extent how much depth they want you to go into. And so when you start D2, you've had some practice with how they work. Did I guess I'll start with Micheline. Did you feel more comfortable with the command verbs in D2 than you did in D1?
Somewhat, yes, I did. I kind of changed my strategy. I created using the command verb. I came out with a framework that I will draft immediately that I read a question, and then I will draft my framework, identifying if I have to do a definition, a description, an example, an assessment, and so forth. And that helped me to kind of concentrated on what to use for each particular question. So I use pretty much the same framework, but then I said, oh, this one I don't need to add an example, or I don't need to get into an assessment. But I use those command verbs and use that framework in order to guide me on how to answer it. When I went into D1, I was writing a lot of information that was not really relevant to the question, is what I come at it, and then I ran out of time. So I had a question that maybe was a 20%, which I wrote a lot, but then I ran out of time to write something that was a 40%. And so I kind of learned to calculate the amount of time that I have to put into that question, and then use the framework just to guide me on the necessary information to get the necessary points to pass the test. So that was going into D2. Granted that I had a little bit more professional background in business, and I did understood the concepts going in. My learning curve was how to use a SWOT or the 5 Ps into the wine industry, because I have used it in engineering for many years. So that was is more the wine language on learning curve plus the material of how to apply that into a scenario that is a wine industry scenario. But that, somewhat I feel more comfortable, and I think the more you practice, like Randy was saying, in writing the questions, the better you become on understanding those command verbs and how much time to put in each one of your answers.
Yeah, and I love that because you're absolutely right. They give you they have their questions that they word, and that's followed by the percentage weighting. So say 20% or something, you should be spending about 20% of your total exam time answering that question. And exactly right. That's how hopefully avoid running out of time. Yeah. Okay. So that's one thing I did want to ask or follow up on. You mentioned a framework. So if you had like a 20%, say, describe question, if that was the command verb, could you tell me a little bit more about the framework you're talking about?
Well, I just use I use a lot of on what was in the specification books and your guidelines of how to deal with the command verb. You have, if you have different things that you need to address if it's a question that is said explain versus describe. So I use those that I was in the book, and then I come out and said, okay, if he said explain, then I need to start at least with the definition of what I need to explain and describe a little bit of that, and then do some kind of assessment and also provide examples. I was lacking on giving examples before. So I came out with using what you have in the book to kind of a skeleton that I will use for each one of them, and then memorize that framework to put it on paper. So it remind me that I have to describe, whatever concept was being asked. If it was an explain a question, then I would go with a definition, with the description, with any assessment if needed to be done, and then an example. So I just used what was in the book, but I created in engineering. You always Everything that you do in a project in engineering, you come out with a framework of how you're going to attack it. So I utilize it engineering techniques into how to answer the questions with the framework.
Got it. Okay, that's cool. So kind of taking the specification, and then it sounds like you're talking about another document published by the WSET, which is kind of their theory guidance document. And
Yeah.
it really goes into how the different command verbs work and what kind of information they're looking for. And so kind of using those documents to almost give yourself a guide of like, okay, if it says this, I need to do this. Yeah.
Yes, and it's kind of
Okay.
like when you're going to write a paper, you kind of start with the table of content of what you want to include in your paper. We do that in engineering. We call it a framework. Okay, what different aspect I need to address? So that's how I turn around the documentation that was provided and convert it in something that became more natural for me to be able to not forget about things that were important to get points for the answer. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what I did.
Oh, cool. Okay, and I agree. Putting things in your own words can be a huge help. Sylvie, how did you feel about the command verbs this time around?
Oh, it was easier. I do the same. I time manage the time, the exam, and I try to see which question I can answer first within a frame time. So I go with that, and all depends on the verb, like describe and explain how I will spend maybe a little bit more time if I need to be more specific. So I just organize my questions with the time frame I have.
Oh, interesting. Did you have like a strategy on the exam for like which questions you did first as far as weightings? Or
Oh
so
yeah.
you'd like do the
Well,
lower
I look
weighted
at the
questions
things.
first?
Yeah, I look
What?
at two things. The easiest one, I start with the easiest ones because I just write it and I see the weighting. If it's 5%, then I just go for it. And then I allot a little bit more time to a 30% or 25%. I will allot more time to that. But I start with the easiest, the one that I know, let's go, because that I can just do it quickly and then I do the other questions.
Yeah. Makes sense. Get yourself a little boost at the beginning of the
Yeah.
exam. And then, yeah, if you can get that done quick, that gives you more time maybe at the end if you have a question that's worth a lot of points, like, a 40% weighted question or something. Okay,
Correct.
good strategy. All right, let's see. Did anybody make any changes to how you were studying as you went along? Like, especially taking into your account your experience with, D1. I'm just curious if anybody kind of made it into D2 and was like, ooh, okay, I think I should change up how I'm doing things, whether it was because the material was different or the volume of material. Randy, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I actually, time was a big issue. It's a huge issue. And my time management on D1 was not the best. I felt like I kept running out of time. So again, going back to you doing those practice questions, and one of about 6 reasons why you need to do them. And that's one of them is because you do kind of understand the time management stuff a little bit better. Other than that, just like Sylvia said, I would read all the questions first, and if I saw some low-hanging fruit, realizing that there's a time management issue on a lot of these exams, and I didn't want to not get to that question because if you know it, you want to get it done. That's just kind of the way I approached it. But yeah, that's about it.
Okay, so yeah, like a similar strategy of get the easy short ones done first, and then okay, fair enough. Yeah, I guess Micheline or maybe Sylvie, did either of you like make any changes to kind of how you were studying?
No.
Did it?
No, I did
Okay, it felt
not.
like it was. Hey, if it feels like it's working, that's fantastic. That's what we want. So, all right, cool.
I did change my strategy on D2 from the perspective of um, practicing more on the questions. So I went through a lot of different forums looking for scenarios and example, to try to learn better the applicability of the concepts versus memorizing the concept. So I went and looked for several scenarios where I could use a SWOT example, in that scenario, or the 5 Ps, or look at the marketing strategies. I did also read a lot more on reports that actually use the concept and topics that were presented in the material of the class and during the class, but then these reports actually utilize those concepts, giving you real data of how that's happening today in the wine industry, and that helped me to better understand the applicability of those concepts in real data, which it become a lot easier for me to then understand them and also get examples that were more real to me, that I can then remember without to have to struggle to memorize a lot of the data. So I think in the D1, I was trying to memorize a lot of stuff because it's not my field. So I had a lot of a steep learning curve to get concept from the wine industry. So I changed that for D2, and I started to more said take the concept and figure out how to apply them using different practice questions and scenarios, until the point that it became natural for me to understand. After I don't know how many questions I practiced on, but I did a lot of them. At the end, I started to see kind of like a pattern in some of these things, that it became natural for me to understand what I needed to answer for different type of scenarios using those concept and topics that were discussed in the class.
Yeah, I mean, this is making me very happy because I'm hearing you guys talk a lot about critical thinking, and so answering, mock exam questions, can help develop that critical thinking skill set that the WSET says they really want to encourage students to work on in the diploma. And so I feel like I say that a lot, and so it's wonderful to hear you guys say that. Say some similar things, and how it helped you work on them as well. So was there anything that surprised anyone in D2? I mean, especially Sylvie, maybe you, because I mean, did you have anything that surprised you at all, just because you work in the wine industry, or did it all feel pretty familiar?
Yeah, it felt pretty familiar. There were things I didn't know about, but I have not only I work in the business, but I have a diploma in business. So, they were pretty much familiar with those the concept and everything. But what I find was helpful is that if there's something I didn't understand, I would try to see if I can have another way of seeing it and look it up elsewhere. So when I come back, it made it easier. So I go beyond a notebook, the workbook. I go beyond that sometimes.
Yeah, and I agree. Sometimes that can help. I think the balance, that you're always like working to strike is, sometimes giving yourself that extra bit of context can help, but then of course also keeping in mind that, it is possible for, like, on so many of these topics, to go almost like too far down the rabbit hole, right? Like, yeah, but I agree. There are sometimes things in the book where it can be hard to learn them just from reading a little paragraph about them, and sometimes like going to YouTube or something to see a video of
Exactly.
how something works. Yeah, it can really help. So, Randy, did anything surprise you?
I'm always surprised taking all these diploma exams on how they can word a question that stuns you for about 2 minutes. You have to figure out what they're
Aren't
asking.
we all?
We all want them to say what color is the banana, and you can just write it down and move on. But yeah, I think that's something you learn to just expect. You expect to be a little stunned and take a minute or two to figure out what they're asking. And then, and taking all these diploma exams that I took, it's always surprising. This might not even be related to this, but it's just always surprising to me. I know how they'll have like a 20 or 25% weighted question that you'll look at it and you're like, I just studied like 200 pages of this stuff, and this question they're asking me is 25% of this grade, and it's about 4 sentences on page 71 or something,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then, so that just gets into a little bit about how you really kind of know, you really have to look at everything and not let anything go by. If they put it in there, they may want you to know it, but
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Sometimes students will ask me, it's like, what's the odds of this showing up on the exam, right? Especially in D3, people ask me that a lot. It's like, what do you think the odds are that this shows up? Or this was the last exam, so they probably won't ask it again right in a row, right? And that is not
exactly.
always the case.
Well, that's
So,
why I think you have to kind of know a little bit of all of it, and I mean, it's not to be intimidating, but the truth of the matter is, like, you have to know the SWOT analysis. You have to spend the time to actually understand it. Because if you get a SWOT question, you could be done. If you get a 5P question and you just say, I know everything, but I kind of know the 5Ps, but I know everything else, and that's 85% or 90%. Well, the test isn't broken up where you get asked a little bit about everything there. If they ask you a 5P question and you don't understand it pretty well, you're going to be in trouble. And part of it you learn, here's another thing when you do the old exams that you learn, is you don't have as many extra points as you think. I didn't have as many extra points as I thought. I used to think, I'm looking at this exam and I see the first three questions are 65% of this whole test. And I'm like, and I know those cold. So that's like 65 points. Maybe I'll miss a couple. And so I don't have to do all that well on this big monster 40% or whatever over here. But then when you start doing the rubrics and you're like, whatever, for example, they might ask you, whatever about the currency exchange, all the different currency exchange ways. And you like say, oh, I know those. And you write down 4, 5, 6, you come up with 6 of them. You go, that should be all of them. There might be another one or so, but that should be most of them. When you do the rubric and you go look at the answers and they say, there's 8 they're looking for. 6 is pass, 7's, merit, and 8's distinction. You're like going, it wasn't hard to pass. I got the 6, but I don't have all these extra points you think you have. So my pearl is that you you on the things like the 5 Ps and on the SWOT, you can't afford to just kind of know them. You really need to spend the time to learn those because they're almost never, in my experience anyway, they're almost never like low weighted questions. They're always like a 40 or 50%er, and I just don't think you have as many points extra as you have. I think the people getting merits are probably getting merit on about every question, not because they have a lot of extra points that put them in that spot. So, not trying to scare you. I'm just telling you that's what I learned. You want to hear my experience? That's my experience.
No, I agree. Well, and I think, one thing I did want to talk about was, the D2 exam. One of the things that's different about it compared to the D1 exam is the total amount of time, right? And so it's actually 60 minutes versus 90 minutes like the D1 exam was. And so sometimes I'll talk to students and there can be a perception that, oh, it's shorter, therefore it's easier. And I don't think that's always the case, right? Because it's more compressed, right? And so you have a little bit less time to recover maybe from a timing error. And so, I mean, kind of like you were saying, Randy, the if they ask a SWOT question or something about the 5 Ps where it's what is it, product, place, people, promotion, what am I forgetting?
Price.
Price. Yeah, I think I forgot price. Yeah. Thanks, guys. So, just in case anybody is watching hasn't taken D2 and is like, what the heck are these 5 Ps they keep talking about? We try and tell students, okay, think of these, techniques, whether it's the 5 Ps or SWOT analyses, as tools you can use to answer, larger questions because they do come up over and over again. And let's see, I know Randy, you could probably speak to this too, in terms of like D3, but they might ask you like evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of Portugal as a wine producing country, right? And so it does come up again. And I think sometimes it can feel very intimidating to have to like memorize those, if that makes sense. And so I try and encourage students to, think of them as tools you can use to help you answer other questions. But kind of getting back to the idea of the exam, I agree. Like if something with a SWOT or maybe the 5 Ps does come up on the exam, it's probably going to be a higher weighted question, just because when they ask a higher weighted question, they do try to pick topics where there's a lot you can write about, right? And so they're not going to ask you a 50% question about something that is in the book and is only like one sentence, right? Because they're not trying to trick you. So, but yeah, sometimes, taking some of those things on board and being able to incorporate them a little bit more holistically into across all of the D2 book, like a SWOT analysis, can come in handy. So I guess that's my very roundabout way, of kind of asking, did the D2 exam feel different to you guys than the D1 exam? And Sylvie, I'll start with you.
Yes, it was different because of the timing. It was shorter, and the topic is totally different. And I think because of your background, depends on your background, you will approach it differently. Business wise, D2 was easy for me because I have a business background in wine, so it was easier than D1. D1, I just needed to memorize more because I don't have a scientific background, and I just needed to learn more and memorize a lot of information. Whereas D2 for me was just, I'm not saying it was not easy, but I kind of understood what they were looking for, and I just went for it.
Okay, cool. So Randy, how did the D2 exam feel compared to the D1 exam for you?
Yeah, I actually didn't notice that time difference. I knew, you had to pay attention to, you get a 25% weighted question. It's only 15 minutes instead of 18 or whatever. But I feel like I have sparks coming off my paper every time I'm writing in one of these tests. So it just goes quick. But I felt like this was more practical from a standpoint of um, just less facts and stuff and more, you had to have a little more thought provoking questions. There definitely was more thought provoking questions that you had to kind of understand the material a little bit broader,
Yeah, that kind of like critical thinking
for sure.
we talked about. Yeah, absolutely. Well, um, I mean, we have a new D2 group starting very soon, and I think some of them will probably be listening in. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting D2? Micheline, I'll start with you.
I really, what I really think that you have to. I read the pamphlet, the information, at least 4 or 5 times this time around. And I really think that you have to learn the applicability of the concepts versus memorizing them, because in the case of D2, these concepts that they are bringing to you for analyzing products or for a branding strategy, for a marketing strategies, are concepts that are, you have to understand how to apply them. If you don't know how to apply them, it doesn't matter if you memorize, the acronym and what they means. But if you don't know how to utilize that in a scenario type of problem that is going to be presented to you, then it's going to be very hard to answer the questions. So I think that is less to memorize in D2, it's more of applicability of the concept. So I recommend reading the material several times, learning those concepts. If you don't have never been exposed to a SWOT of the 5 Ps, just go and Google. There's plenty of examples out there that explain you in lame terms what those tools are and how they're used, and maybe start using them in something that is more familiar to you, so you kind of grasp the concept, and then start using it in a wine industry scenario. So then you can have something to compare, something that you're familiar, something that is new. That's how I was able to kind of apply what I knew about the concept in the wine industry for this test. And then practice to write the questions. I think that one thing that I kind of did less than what in D1 was. In D1, I was trying to summarize everything that was in the book, and then write it in my own terms. And I spent a lot of time doing that. In D2, I just summarized the key concepts with examples that feel familiar to me. So then that my subconscious will will record them, and then when I see something that it was similar, I could apply it. So I just summarizing the key concepts with some examples helped me to then know how to use those concepts during the examination.
I like that. Trying to put some of the material into kind of your own words, but like in ways where you can mentally think through this of something, right? So instead of just like reading in the book about this is how currency fluctuations work, because that's one of the topics a lot of people are like, and they get really scared of. But
Yeah.
finding an article in some magazine or something, it's like, well, here's our experience with inflation, or or how we navigated making purchases in different countries within the EU, or something like that. Yeah, it can help you cement that knowledge a little more clearly.
A couple of art reports. I actually have friends around the world they are in the wine industry. So I reach out to them and I say, hey, can you reach to your embassy and give me the China wine market today? What they're writing on China, what China is writing on what they're gonna do, and then same with a friend in Chile and some with a friend in Spain. So I got the embassy report on their wine industry, and then
Oh, wow.
I started looking at that data. That was exactly what the book was saying, but more in a real data
Mm.
scenario, and that kind of helped us say, oh, that's what the book means by, when the currency is in fluctuation, this is how they affect it. Or when China put the trade tariff into Australia, that's how they're affected, and this is how now Spaniards are trying to get advantage of that. So I tried to put all that in a concept by reading material that then was kind of with all the concept that the class was teaching, but a more real today's scenario, and that really helped me to kind of understand that type of concepts.
Yeah, yeah, and you can get a lot of information like that from like regional wine trade bodies as well. Like I'm thinking of like Wine Australia. They always have all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, organizations like that. Thank you, Sylvie. Do you have any advice you would share with a beginning D2 student?
Well, read and read and read the notebook. Practice, practice, practice the questions. And lastly, I would just say that a trick that I use is to pretend you're teaching to a class, and you do all the different how, whys, what's the effect and everything, and you just verbalize it. And I think that helped me a lot, as if I'm teaching someone that course. So those are the three things I do.
Yeah, I like that because you learn very quickly if you can explain something to someone else, whether or not you know it, right? So, yeah, I
Exactly.
agree 100%. Or even if it's your dog, and you feel a little silly at first,
Which
like,
I did,
just
and he's
yeah,
very versatile.
Yeah,
yeah, that can help you figure out what was that?
I use my husband as my guinea pig. So I explain him everything, and he asks me questions. And sometimes he's like, "Okay, I don't want to know anything else about wine." But
Yeah.
really, when they ask questions and you don't know the answer, or you start to kind of have trouble answering, then I need to go back and study more because I really do not have a good grasp on the concept.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Randy, any advice?
So advice for D2. I think up until through chapter 7, it's fairly straightforward. I think if they ask you whatever, name whatever the businesses that produce wine, and you list them, and you should kind of memorize like what are the 7 or whatever they put on there, in the textbook, and you define each one of them, and you know what's unique about them and why they're the same as some of the other ones and why they're different some of the other ones. Those are the questions you're going to get. They're pretty straightforward. I already talked about it, so I won't belabor it. But when you get into the business stuff, the SWOT analysis, you need to spend some time. And I think spending time doing those old questions is the key for all the reasons I mentioned before. Speed is a huge deal. Don't get caught up. I did this before, is why I say it. Don't think I'm going to need 15 minutes for this last question, but I'm really going well on this third question, so I'm just going to use 5 minutes of it and leave 10. It doesn't work. If you have like a couple points you want to put down, you can do it in a minute, do it, but you need to get on to that next question. I can actually remember you and well in one of your lectures talking about a SWOT, and you were talking about how you break it down into paragraphs, and in the fourth would be say strengths and weaknesses, and then opportunities and threats, and you'd say you do that because you have to hit on all those or you won't pass. And I think that's true. I don't think you can say I really know strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, and that's 75%, so I'm good. I don't think it works that way very well, not with the European grading system. I think you need to save time and just move on and get to all the questions.
Yeah.
And by doing all those little questions, the speed really really helps your speed, because you're going to learn all the different angles they're asking you about. For example, a SWOT again, the different kinds of questions they ask for that. You're going to practice setting up your answer, and that takes a lot of time. And if you're pretty quick at doing it because you've answered a bunch of those questions before, all that really plays into the speed part. And there's some freebies in there, like in a SWOT, for just an example, in the Pescal mnemonic there, I couldn't find a SWOT where like climate change wasn't applicable. There's a few in there you'll see every time. You're like, you can always throw in climate change, because it's just always there. It's either, yeah, the grapes are getting, whatever, riper in England, so we're making better champagne, or we're having to add new grapes to Bordeaux because it's too warm. But either way, it always works. So you'll find like 3 or 4 of those that are automatics because it seems to fit in every single scenario. But that's about it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we do well.
That sounds good. Well, that sort of ties into another thing I wanted to ask. You guys are giving me great segues today. The WSET calls D1 and D2 foundational units, right? And so what that means is that anything you learn in D1 or D2 can show up, and you can kind of be tested on it later in the diploma program. And so I remember, for example, like one time on the D2 exam, maybe a year or two ago, there was a question that really threw some people, and it was basically asking students to explain the costs through the winemaking process for, I think it was like a premium Russian River Valley Chardonnay or something like that. And, so there was a lot of D1 stuff that you had to incorporate into your answer, but the focus of it was costs, right? And so that's how they tied it into D2. And so, keeping that in mind, I'm curious if any of you felt like, the D2 knowledge has helped you with later units, because you all are now, either almost done, or Randy, I think you are done now, aren't you?
Yes, I'm done.
Yeah. So I would love to hear, I guess, well, Randy, I'll go to you first since it's a done deal for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, it actually helped out all the way through, I mean, when you're just trying to think of some examples about, like, when you talk about Burgundy and you're talking about merchants and brokers in Bordeaux, and talking about co-ops in Italy or whatever, I mean, it just keeps kind of coming back. I don't have a whole lot more than that. I will tell you, I remember I was taking a different exam, and someone had just come out of the sparkling wine exam, and they were just furious because it had a business question on there. I already took business, they're going on, and everybody was jumping on board with it too. So I mean, there's no question it's a foundational chapter, and you want to learn it well, and you'll probably see some of that stuff again. But yeah, it wasn't any one thing, but it did come up a lot, because those were just, especially someone like me, that was, those are new words for me, merchants and brokers and wine and all that. And when you would see them reading those sections, you knew what you're talking about. So you knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Cool. Sylvie, anything you've been able to kind of, like, you've noticed you've pulled from D2 into a later unit?
Oh yeah, I'm doing D3 now, and I did D4 and D5, and it definitely helps with cost, labor. I mean, it helps so much that when I'm doing D3 or the others, I know that part. It helps a lot. So
Yeah.
if they ask a question, what's all the effect of the pricing and cost, I already know what I need to put down, and probably not spend that much time on that part for any other module. So it really helps to know D1 and D2. It really does help.
Cool. Miss Shalene, anything you found particularly useful?
I'm taking D5 now, which is the fortified wines. So you can see components of D2 from the perspective of when you study the D5 and the fortified wine, and you see the consumer preference trends on fortified wines. So that's something that you learn what it is in D2, but you see it when you start studying fortified wines and how that industry has declined through the years, based on different factors, and one of them is consumer preference, and how they are currently trying to target the younger generation by doing more type of cocktails with fortified wines with lower alcohol. So that all those concepts are taught in D2. And you see it now. I'm seeing them now in D5.
Absolutely. Oh, cool. That was a good example. So, all right. Well, I mean, one thing I did want to touch on. I mean, Micheline, you already were like upfront and mentioned this. You know, sometimes you take an exam and it just does not go well, right? And so you find out later that you failed it, and it's horrible. It's not a good feeling. You know, these are hard exams. And so, I mean, Micheline, I'll start with you. You know, do you, you know, I would love to hear kind of how you overcame the challenge of failing an exam and, you know, kind of moved on to, you know, just get over that.
Yeah, no, you know, it's you take it hard, especially when when you have never failed in anything in your college years. So I'm like, okay, I have two master degrees. I never fail. I go to one class and I fail this test.
Yeah.
So you take it hard, and so it was a moment that I said, okay, I'm doing this more as a hobby. Maybe I just hit a level that is more for people in the wine industry. So I went through that thought, and then I just drink a couple of glass of wine, and I give it another thought, and I said, well, I'm going to take D2. I asked the question, can I take D2 and see how I do in D2, which is I have a little bit more of background. And then I passed the D2 test, and it kind of get the energy that I went, and I took the D1 again. I'm still waiting for my results. So hopefully I don't become the one that I have to take D1 several times and break that record. But I think that I just decided that I could do it. That I just need to change my strategy, put a little bit more time on learning the concepts and the applicability of those concepts, and it's starting to translate the wine language and nomenclature into something that was more familiar to me, so I could make an association to it, and try not to memorize as much as I was trying to do, because it was not going to work. Because under stress, English as a second language is not
Yeah.
going to work. I'm going to forget things, and then I'm going to block what I know, and then time is going to pass, and I'm not going to be able to get to the question, because I have stressed out myself to a point that I cannot remember anything. So I started to more going into the applicability, and that's how I went back to D1, to the retest, with a framework of things that needed to be addressed if questions will come out in that sense, on that area, meaning if it was about winemaking, all the components within winemaking, if it was a particular product, everything from the grape to bottle. I come out with my own framework that I know I have to address, A to D, or A to Z, to be able to remember those. So it just it's a challenge to overcome, especially if you're doing it like I'm doing it. I'm doing it for hobby, but I can believe if somebody's doing it for a job, that probably would be harder to take, as you invest in time and money on doing this. I just learned that I developed a plan after that of how I was going to attack the rest of the diploma, and the time that I needed to allocate to study to make it as actually if I was going to do a master degree. So just have an allocated time for reading, and allocated time for research, and allocated time to practice, and then like Sylvie says, have somebody to explain what I'm learning, which in this case is my husband, that I can practice the concepts that I'm learning, and then I can be challenged with questions to the point where then I can feel comfortable explaining to somebody else. So developing a plan, and learning that sometimes you fail. Failing teaches something, and that's how I took it. And then I came back and see how it goes from here on.
Yeah. No, and I agree, and thank you for sharing that, and I think, um, yeah, it's, you know, these are hard exams, and, uh, Sylvia, I believe you have passed every exam you have taken, which is wonderful. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's good. So yeah, I mean, like so my story, I did pass every diploma exam that I when I took it the first time, which was awesome. I spent a year in the Master of Wine program and bombed the stage one assessment first time I took it. And my boss, I had the worst tasting day of my life. It was horrendous. My boss told me, hey, take the rest of the day off when I got my results and go drink a wine that makes you remember, why you're doing this in the first place, right? So that's very good advice. But sometimes I'll tell students that if you haven't failed a wine exam yet, you haven't been trying long enough. So, but yeah. And so, I mean, Randy, I have you left here. And so I know, especially as a graduate, I would love to hear kind of your pathway through the diploma program and how you kind of overcame some challenges.
Yeah, so I didn't pass the business exam, and first off, I'll tell you, I thought I passed. I was kind of surprised, and I thought, man, I have horrible handwriting, as you would suspect, and I thought maybe they can't read when I'm writing, And then and I really did feel like I passed it. So I spent the money and I sent it in, and they sent me back, some good advice. You could have done this, could have done this, and at the very end they wrote, "You were very close," and then they said, "Most of your information was correct, but it wasn't deep enough for the diploma level." And I thought, man, I felt like I read it deep, but honestly, you know what? When I went back and passed it with merit, I was like, I knew it 4 times better, and I have to almost respect the fact that they aren't letting you just kind of read it, and get through it without really knowing it, because it feels so much better to really dig in, because I dug in because I wasn't happy at all with that. And really dug in and learned it. I really did feel like I knew it 4 times better when I took the next exam and passed it. So yeah, it's a miserable feeling when you're sitting there thinking, I never flunked a medical school exam, but I'm flunking my wine exam here. You got to be kidding me.
Well, if you as a doctor sat here and if you told me that you thought the diploma was harder than medical school, you would not be the first doctor to tell me that. So.
Some of the exams were along those lines, I will tell you that. But I have to laugh because I was listening to a discussion when I was taking business the second time around. And I remember a guy asking the question back there. He says, I have an MBA in business and I flunked this exam. I need to know what's going on here. I'm thinking, I feel a little bit better now.
Yeah, so. Well, and absolutely. And, sometimes I talk to students who do work in the wine industry. And some of you have imagined trying to think through this situation. Like, what if you work in the wine industry and you fail the wine business exam, right? Like that can be really a hard thing to take. And so, sometimes I tell students that these exams, they test a very specific set of skills, right? Knowledge is one of them, but that's not the only skill they're testing, right? Another skill that's tested in these exams is, how you answer this very specific style of question, right? And so that is also a skill that requires practicing, which we've kind of been talking about in terms of, handling the command verbs and how they can be a clue to help you figure out what to write. So anyway, Randy, did you feel, because I think if I recall correctly, your path through was that you failed D2 and then you went back and, well, you did all the other units, right? And then you went back and took the REACH-SAT D2 at the end?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. What did you, I would love to hear a little bit about, like how you felt like your approach kind of changed between the first time you took D2 and the second time you took it.
Well, yeah, I've said a bunch, that I started looking at old exams, and I was doing that, or the practice exams, and I was doing that with these other units too. And, if you do that a lot, you start kind of seeing the same question. You don't see the exact same question, but you'll definitely see 2 of the 4 questions that are going to look very familiar. They might not be the same question with a different grape or whatever, so it helps you a ton, to do them, because it just, there's a lot of reasons. Time management's a big deal, and if you kind of are familiar with the question right away, you don't have to spend that extra 4 minutes to figure out what you're going to do with it, because you've already done it. That's probably the most important thing I did. I honestly just doing everything you guys tell us to do, which is not what I did in the very beginning. I mean, you should do this, you should do this. Paid more attention to the command verbs. Like, you didn't ask me that question about the command verbs. I would have told you I didn't feel any different about the command verbs, the second one, or the third one, or the fourth one. Every time, I knew how important they were though by then, and every time I had to go within that week of taking the next exam I would go back and go over the command verbs and make sure I understood them, because you start to just realize that it doesn't matter how much information you have in that paragraph or how eloquently you wrote it. If you didn't answer that, I mean, somewhere before, during, or after, before you move on to the next question, you have got to look at the command verbs and say, did I or did I not answer those? So those are just some things that I did to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I appreciate you guys sharing. I know it's not always easy to talk about when, a time when you failed something, right? Because people pay a lot of money and for this certification, you put a lot of work into it, right? And so, yeah, thank you. Okay, so real quick, just to kind of finish up, does anybody else have any advice or any other thoughts they would like to share? We're feeling good?
No, I hope you all do well.
Cool. I mean, you guys have
I hope
shared a
all-
lot, so I appreciate your candor. So awesome. Well, so thank you to our three wonderful panelists for joining today, and thank you for everyone else listening in. So have a good day, everybody.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.